Hello and welcome to the Sustainability Skill Set Podcast, a show where we explore careers in sustainability and the skills you need to succeed. I'm glad you're here. If you are passionate about sustainability and hungry to learn, you're in the right place. I'm your host, DeMaso, a sustainability consultant and young sustainability professional learning right along with you. Today we have Kealy Herman with us. Kealy has an impressive history of creating sustainability strategies and managing climate projects. She spent 8 years working for the consulting company WSP, holding roles such as project director for sustainability, energy, and climate change. She also led Google's supply chain climate strategy. She is currently global technical director of net zero strategy for another consulting company, Arcadis. Kealy is also a passionate sustainability career coach, having published a fantastic article about the skills needed for a career in sustainability and another comparing consulting versus in-house sustainability roles. In these articles, she says, as you may have seen, the corporate sustainability job market is hot right now, but what does it actually take to do the work? This is the central idea of the Sustainability Skill Set Podcast, and I am very excited to share our discussion with you today. All right. Thanks so much for joining me, Kealy. It's great to have you on.
It's great to be here.
So you were talking just a moment ago about how interested you are in helping people get climate jobs and jobs in sustainability. Could you talk just a little bit about what your interest is in right off the bat?
Yeah, I have this dream or vision that every job becomes a climate job. And I don't mean necessarily that everyone is explicitly working on climate and sustainability, but more that we integrate it so deeply into the way that we do business and run organizations that everybody touches climate and understands how their individual decisions and day-to-day work can have a positive or a negative impact on the environment. And I think we need a lot more people to work with data and get it into the hands of everyone so they can make informed decisions in order to accomplish that. And so I'm super passionate about getting as many people into climate careers as we possibly can, partially to help see that vision become a reality, but also because I've had a really amazing career in this space. And I think if folks are interested, they can do the same. And I just want to help people live their passion.
That's awesome. You sound super passionate, and it's an incredible career path to be involved with. And like you said, any job can be a sustainability job, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. You've written 2 LinkedIn articles that are really interesting about skills in the sustainability arena. I was wondering if you could describe a little bit about 3 of the key activities that sustainability professionals perform in their jobs and in their companies.
Yeah, absolutely. I've kind of broken it down in thinking about my entire career and working mostly in the corporate space, but some in the public sector as well on sustainability. And we essentially do 3 things. We determine how to make an organization more sustainable. We convince the decision makers of said organization to make the changes. And then we ensure that those changes are successfully implemented. That really starts with establishing some kind of baseline of how you are performing today. A lot of times that takes a form of a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, but it can also be things like waste inventories, life cycle assessment of the products that you make, any kind of way to measure your organization's impact on the environment. You might also do a materiality assessment to decide which metrics you should actually measure, which metrics matter to your internal and external stakeholders, because carbon may matter more to some stakeholders, waste to others, water to others. And it really depends on what industry you're in. And so those are kind of basic activities that are like the underlayment for figuring it out what it is you can do as an organization to reduce your impact on the environment. And from there, you will get hotspots, right? From a greenhouse gas footprint, from an LCA, you will see where your biggest impacts are. And that's where I like to focus to figure out what you can do to make your organization more sustainable. I think 10, 15 years ago, a lot of organizations were understandably focused on their scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions, which is the operational emissions of an organization. So burning fuels for heat, the fleet vehicles that they drive, the electricity that their buildings and facilities use, those kinds of emissions, because we can measure them pretty readily. And it's kind of a known space and you have control over those activities. Scope 3, which is all the rest of the emissions in your value chain, including your supply chain, the users of your products, and everyone in between, is a lot harder to measure. And 10 or 15 years ago, most commonly, we were seeing companies say, here's our business travel emissions and how we can reduce them. Well, it turns out business travel is not a huge source of emissions for most companies. And so all of these companies were reporting on and figuring out how to reduce this piece of emissions that was very, very small. And so having that baseline will help you really identify what are the hotspots and what should you be focusing your time on, and essentially like what's worth your time, right? Because you may be an organization that travels a ton, a management consulting firm that sends people on site every single week. They've got a lot of business travel. But your average Fortune 500, like business travel just is not in the top 5 sources of environmental impact. So you figure out what to focus on. And then I really like to look all over the organization for inspiration for how to make those reductions. So talk to process engineers, facility managers, research and development, even HR and finance, and say, hey, what are your ideas for reducing our footprint? It's your job as a sustainability consultant to say, yes, that makes sense or can be done, or no, that can't be done, or no, it's not worth the investment. But really like crowdsourcing those ideas to reduce your footprint. And then as a sustainability consultant, we come in and do all of the analysis and figure out, okay, what's the bang for our buck? How much emissions reduction do we get for each investment that we make, which is known as the marginal cost of abatement. And so we can kind of build those curves that tell us what are the smart investments versus what are the not so smart investments. So that's kind of that step one. Convincing the decision makers is probably what I spend most of my time doing, and it's one of my favorite things to do. And it's really all about change management. Sometimes the decisions are really easy and they make their own financial case, right? They've got a positive ROI, a payback period of less than 3 years. Essentially, the organization should have done it already. And it is an easy sell. There are other things that are a much harder sell. And I think on-site solar is a really great example of that. It's something that organizations care about and want to do because it's so visible to their employees and their customers. And it does save money on electricity. But the payback period is 8 to 12 years in like a good case. It can be much longer than that, depending on a lot of different factors. And so it can be kind of a hard pill for organizations to swallow. And so a couple of ways that we do that. One is taking a portfolio of projects. So instead of presenting every project individually, wrap them all up together so that your blended return on investment and payback period include all those projects that have great financials and also the projects that aren't going to pay back as fast, but still make sense to do. And so that will give the organization a sense of what does it mean financially if we do all of these projects together. And then the other thing too is really not about sustainability at all. It is about what matters to the organization and what matters specifically to the decision makers. When I worked at Davidson College, which was my first job out of school, I had gone to Davidson College. They hired me to create a sustainability program. And I had to get our long-term climate targets approved by the board. And I spent a lot of time working with various departments on campus who interface with the board of trustees a lot, like donor relations and things like that, and figured out that while they might not know a lot about sustainability, it was the South in 2008, after all, it wasn't top of mind for them, right? What they cared about was that the students had the same experience as they had. And we're talking not just today's students, but their grandchildren's grandchildren who went to Davidson. They wanted them to have the same student experience. And so what I did was I aligned my messaging to that core value. And I said, I want your grandchildren's grandchildren to have the same experience that I had while I was at Davidson. And here is how sustainability can ensure that we can do that. And we got unanimous approval for the goals. Some of the things I put in place there are still happening. They just last year released an update to the climate action plan that I wrote in 2010. And so really doing your homework and figuring out what matters to each individual decision maker and the organization as a whole can help you be a lot more successful. And then finally, ensuring that change is successfully implemented. Part of this is about measurement, right? It is making sure that you can track, okay, you did this LED lighting upgrade. Here's where it shows up in your utility bills, in your cost saves, reduced emissions, showing that progress over time to your stakeholders. And then also making sure that the organization is set up from a governance perspective to kind of make it happen. And that can look like a lot of different things depending on the organization. Lots of organizations have sustainability champions or green teams. I think those can be a great way to really deploy people throughout the organization where sustainability isn't their job, but we can make it part of their job because they care about it. They can really help ensure that things like timers on lighting or different equipment use protocols stay in place over time. And then I think too, just having the right governance so that when something isn't going well or according to plan, that it gets appropriately escalated and that there is a level of responsibility. And that could be, tying financial benefits to senior leaders to the sustainability goal achievement. It could mean a lot of different things, but really ensuring that the organization fully integrates sustainability.
Yeah. Crowdsourcing those ideas from the people who are on the front lines actually doing the jobs and everything is so important, right?
They know the operation better than any of us.
Mm-hmm. And then setting up those proper incentives. Yeah, that's all really good stuff. I love the example of aligning the messaging with core values to find really what drives decision makers and then being able to leverage that to make the sustainability changes that you want to see.
Honestly, if you don't do that, you're going to get a no every time.
And those are the kinds of communication skills and change management skills that are so important, right? The baseline and prioritization is another big part of what I'm interested in and what seems to be such a key first step because organizations can't tackle everything at once, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to have some way to prioritize, especially because sustainability teams are small, usually, except for like the Fortune 50. You've got 1, 2, maybe 3 people working on it. They can't do everything.
Yeah.
And so having a really clear plan of what to tackle first and why is, again, just going to help you get buy-in because you're going to show your business leaders, hey, we have thought critically about this and we have a plan.
How many projects do you typically see companies start with, or do you think that is ideal for starting with?
I think companies or the other organizations should start with 12 months of the first step of setting the baseline, doing a materiality assessment, and establishing a high-level plan for how to reduce their environmental impacts. I think a lot of companies want all of that to happen in 3 months, and it isn't that simple. And you can do it in 3 months. Your plan isn't going to be detailed enough for you to take action on. And it's also probably going to have so many estimations and assumptions that it kind of isn't that useful. And so I think really taking a step back and saying, we're going to devote some serious time to figuring out where we are is very, very important. And then I think once you have that plan, figuring out how to deploy projects is such a sort of personal decision, if you will, for each organization. I think it depends on how many project managers you have, what your capital budget looks like, what other funding sources you might be able to get. There's a lot of federal and state funding available these days for various decarbonization technologies. And so if you can take advantage of some of those, you can kind of front load some things. We also do some analysis for our clients that helps them think through the cost of putting off an investment. And so we can kind of help optimize when to install solar at each location based on the anticipated cost and the anticipated grid greening of that region, so that you can kind of get the biggest bang for your buck. So really diving into those details, which you cannot do unless you have a detailed baseline. So yeah, I say go all in on figuring out where you are.
Sounds like the number of projects to start with is one, and that is build the sustainability strategy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So for people who are interested in trying to perform these functions within their company or within another company, obviously there's a specific kind of skill set that really can help someone be super successful in doing so. Are there certain skills that are across the board important for sustainability work?
Yeah, I talk a lot about this in my article, and this is just my kind of perspective based on my career, but a few skills do really stand out to me. One of them we've already talked about, it's change management. It is figuring out how to align your messaging to other people's core values. It is figuring out how the organization is structured so that you can build sustainability into that structure, and everything that comes with it. And I think there are a lot of careers that use change management and develop change management skills that could be quite transferable. So if you are looking to transition into a climate career, I think if you have change management skills, that's a great thing to highlight. Another one is data and analytics. It's just so foundational. You don't have to love data and analytics. You don't have to do it for the majority of your job, but you need to have kind of a working knowledge of how to calculate a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, or something more specific, like be an expert in LCA, or there are some other more nuanced things like GIS that you could kind of go down rabbit holes on. But some level of data and analytics, and most importantly, really figuring out how to translate big data sets that are highly complex in many cases for executive audiences, and looking at the data and seeing, okay, what story is being told to us by this data? What is the data telling us to do? And translating that for executive audiences to say, here's a strategy and this is why it makes sense. And that kind of leads into my next one, which is communication. I think this is true across all careers that we have to be good communicators. But sustainability and climate, it's especially important. There's a lot of nuance to things. People often get confused between the difference between, carbon offsets and renewable energy credits. You have to use those words very carefully. Same with science-based targets, carbon neutrality, net zero. There are so many terms out there that are overlapping and have things in common, but are uniquely different that you need to be able to convey to a really wide variety of audiences. And so it really just can't be understated, the importance of communication, both verbal and written, but also visual communication, because we do use big data so often. And then the last one is really curiosity. And honestly, I'm super biased here. One of my strengths is learning. I am a lifelong learner. I love asking questions. I think in preparation for this discussion, you asked if I wanted to focus on anything. I said, yes, I have a question, because I always have questions. And that's really how you do all of this. Asking questions is a key part of change management to find out what drives an organization. Asking questions is a key part of data analytics, and it's also a key part of figuring out how to communicate effectively. So really just being curious. And I think practicing being curious is something that not a lot of professionals necessarily focus on. And so really taking time in your day-to-day to have some kind of creative output or activity that you do. It could be, art. It could be dog training. It can be so many different things where you can exercise your creative muscles, because practice makes improvement.
I love your focus on curiosity and calling that out as a skill specifically, especially in sustainability, where it's such a fast-moving industry and such a fast-moving space that staying ahead of it and staying relevant is so based on your ability to keep up with trends and see where things are going. And it's exciting.
It is. And I think especially in consulting, we are helping our clients solve problems that haven't been solved before. And we're helping clients answer questions where we don't necessarily know the answer at the beginning of the project. We're going to help them figure it out. And it takes a lot of curiosity.
Yeah. So with the data and analytics, you talked about some very specific skills. I'm wondering, do you think that niching down to very unique data and analytics skills is an important part of that? Or is kind of broad data and analytics translating those big data sets sufficient for certain types of roles?
I think both of those are correct. It really honestly depends on what you want to do. I am a generalist, and so I've got an inch deep across a huge breadth of topics, including data and analytics. I mostly work in Excel. My teams work in Excel, with a little bit of dabbling in things like Tableau and Power BI for data visualization. And I think that is sufficient especially for the consulting world. For those that have a tech background that might have skills in particular coding languages or, statistical analysis packages, things like that. I think there's a lot of value to be added there. It's not really something I know a ton about because it's not my area of expertise. But there's a whole Slack channel called Work on Climate, which is basically tech people trying to figure out how to do better things for the planet, which I think is amazing and so needed, especially because we need people like me who can set the baseline and help an organization set a target. And we also need people who can code new apps to make that data more accessible to people and integrate it into their daily lives. So I think both of those approaches is useful, but you should pick one and be very purposeful about which one you pick.
That's a great recommendation there at the end. Yeah, either one would get you there, but having either a wide breadth of skills or a huge depth in one particular skill would both be good strategies, right?
Yeah.
That's great. So you mentioned how certain skills are particularly relevant to consulting. And one of the other LinkedIn articles you wrote was about comparing sustainability career in consulting versus one that is in-house to a specific company. What are the major differences in your eyes between a consulting role and an in-house role?
That's such a great question. I started my career in-house, went to consulting, went back to in-house, and I'm now back in consulting. So I've experienced both worlds, both in the public sector and the private sector. And I think one of the main differentiators for me is just the level of specialization. In general, consultants are more generalists and in-house teams are more specialists. There's obvious exceptions to that rule. But I think if you want to be a specialist, you are more likely to have success in the in-house sphere, especially since we've seen over the last year and a half or 2 years that sustainability teams are expanding pretty rapidly. Some of the big tech firms have literally hundreds of people working on sustainability. Those are specialists. When I worked at Google, I was a specialist on supply chain decarbonization, specifically within the IT hardware manufacturing supply chain, mostly in Asia. So I was very, very specialized.
Yeah.
At least it felt that way to me. I was still working on, energy and process emissions and renewables and lots of different topics, but within that very kind of specified domain of IT hardware manufacturing. And so that's kind of what I've found. And it's part of why I made the transition back to consulting is that I am better as a generalist, as it turns out.
You're too curious, right?
I am too curious. I want to do all the things. A few of the other differences are consistency, kind of the mix of skills. One thing I like to call it is how deeply integrated you get into the politics of an organization. Consulting organizations have their own politics, obviously. But when you're in consulting, you are sort of aware of some of the internal politics of your clients, but you are not deeply rooted or involved in them. And because you're kind of a degree or two separated, they don't take as much of an emotional toll. And when you are in an in-house team, the emotional toll of politics kind of cannot be understated, especially if the politics are not great. So that kind of depends on the organization, but you are in it, you have to live those politics every single day. Whereas in consulting, you have multiple projects across multiple clients and you're a little bit removed. So I find it doesn't drag me down as much. And I have chosen a firm that has what I think is excellent internal politics for the most part. So I'm able to manage those really well. So I think just thinking about kind of culture and fit is really important. And then another thing too is internal collaboration. And this one actually kind of surprised me, which is partially because I've worked with some clients who approach it differently than others. But a lot of times in consulting, you don't collaborate with a lot of internal partners within your client organizations. You have one primary point of contact and maybe another 2 or 3 people that you're interfacing with on a regular basis for that project, but you don't have the broader organizational context of what all of the different departments are doing and how the business really functions. And so I think that is something that I didn't really expect when I went into consulting, and it can be hard to do the change management when you don't know enough people. I do have and have had some clients in the past where I was really integrated into their team. I spent lots of time on site pre-COVID and got to know dozens of people within the organization. So it definitely can happen that you're more integrated. But I think generally in consulting, you are kind of kept at arm's length. And that definitely has its pros and cons.
Yeah, making change from the outside sounds like a huge piece of consulting. And do you have any tips for how to manage that, how to wiggle your way in and make change through maybe one or two major points of contacts?
The answer is to stay curious, ask lots and lots of questions. I think something that's interesting too is that some companies find a ton of value in the sort of third-party consulting perspective and expertise on what they should be doing. And so if you can identify whether that's true or not, that's helpful, because where that is true, it'll be easier for you to talk to more people. But where people kind of are wary of consultants, maybe they've had a bad experience, it's not as easy. So that their attitude about consultants matters. But really asking questions, the right questions, but also asking questions until you figure out what the right question is.
Can't be afraid to ask questions.
Yeah, you can't be afraid. And I also, like from a consulting perspective, I like to make sure we've got lots of that built into the scope. And that can take the form of workshops. We do a lot of design thinking workshops at Arcadis, which I love because it brings lots of stakeholders into the room, but is pretty light touch as far as level of effort for our clients, right? They can invite 20 stakeholders and all we need of them is 90 minutes. And so that's helpful. So as much as you can kind of build that in and set that expectation that, hey, this strategy is going to be much, much better if we can get some engagement from the key stakeholders in your organization.
That's great. It sounds like you use different types of skills when you've been an in-house sustainability professional versus a consultant sustainability professional. Are there any particular skills that you'd say that really jump out as being part of the consultant skill set versus the in-house skill set?
I would say consultants crave variety, or at least are okay with it.
Right.
Our days are extremely varied. We jump from project to project. The amount of time I spend trying to minimize task switching is incredible, because there's lots of evidence that says task switching isn't good for your brain or productivity. But it's required of consultants because we have multiple projects and clients at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so you have to be able to manage all of that. But honestly, like, it's part of what I love. I love the variety. I love having new problems to solve every day and kind of having to like figure out, okay, which client am I working for? What is their culture like? What are they trying to do? To really get into that mindset of being at that company versus another. And yeah, I think just like really quickly learning and navigating all of their kind of culture and politics, which is, again, like, that's fun for me. I love getting to know people and learning about kind of what makes an organization tick. It's like a puzzle. And you have to do that over and over and over again. Whereas when you're in-house, like, you figure out your organization's puzzle and then it's kind of solved. Like, it can evolve and change, of course, but you kind of get it down and figure out how to work within that world, and then you don't have to figure it out again. Whereas I have to figure it out every time I get a new client.
And it's clear that you crave that variety and you really love the learning aspect of it.
I do, absolutely.
So one of the quotes from the article that stuck out to me was that in-house work tends to involve more execution than consulting. And I was wondering if you think that means that in-house work can be more impactful, or whether consulting can be equally as impactful despite not focusing on the execution part.
I love that question. What a hard-hitting question. Oh my gosh. So I will start by saying I think my work is very impactful, and I'm a consultant. So I think you can definitely have as much impact in both. I think to me, it's more of, what are your strengths? What are you good at? What do you want to be doing? And for me, I'm not really an executor, which could sound really bad. Like, I can't always get shit done. I admit it. Okay. It's the truth. There are unfinished projects in this room. And that's because I'm an idea person. I'm a strategy person. I love figuring out how to solve a problem, making a plan, making lots of contingency plans for everything that could possibly go wrong so that everyone is very prepared. But then I need to hand it off to an executor, to someone who can really get it done, and follow the plan that I have laid out. And I'm so there for questions and to help when something does go awry, because I can tell you I have thought about that situation and I am ready for it. But executing is just not my jam, and that's okay. And I think that's part of why I love consulting, is that it's so heavily focused on strategy and helping organizations figure out what on earth they should be doing, that we leave it to their amazing project managers to execute. And I think that's something that people can really think about when they're considering consulting versus in-house roles, is if you love getting into the weeds and getting a project across the finish line, maybe in-house is a slightly better fit. They have more sort of program management roles where that's what you do. And that is what I was doing at Google as well. Yeah, I had a strategy role, so it was a combination of both. But I've just found that I prefer the sort of strategy and high-level planning aspects of it. And I think because we also do have such a focus on continuous improvement in consulting and measuring and reporting progress, that's part of our work. We kind of just skip the execution phase. We say, here's what you should do. You go do it. We will help you measure what you have done and report on that. And so we are still kind of a part of that impact. And I think we can own some of that impact and share it with the company that's actually executed it.
It must be great when you get to see that the strategy you helped design actually is getting implemented and driving change.
It's so fun. I love celebrating success with my clients, shouting them out on LinkedIn, giving them a cheers when I see them at an event. It's really exciting. And even though I don't necessarily have boots on the ground in the execution and implementation phases, I still very much feel like a part of the win, and my clients feel that I'm a part of the win too.
So it sounds like with execution, you almost have to put the blinders on and not get distracted or drawn away by new ideas and be able to just execute the plan, which is a whole skill set in and of itself. But that the strategy component coming before that is equally as important. So it just depends on where you prefer and where you're best suited to have that impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the world was full of people like me who just did strategy and no one did anything about it, I would be useless.
Right.
By the same token, if the world was only full of people who were great executors, they would run around executing projects and not know why they were doing it, what impact they might be having, whether they should do A versus B. I'm exaggerating here, but we need both pieces to work together.
That's so true. And it ties back into some of the first things we talked about how it's important to prioritize and create that baseline from the beginning, because then you can really see how everything's going to tie together into the larger picture rather than just going down a bunch of different unrelated rabbit holes and trying to make change where your larger strategy won't really come together.
Exactly. Plus, the strategy gives everyone this kind of North Star that hopefully is inspiring. And builds motivation for the executing team to do the projects and do them really well.
That's awesome. Having come from both multiple in-house roles and multiple consulting roles, it's really clear that you have experience doing both and can really tease out those differences, which I really enjoy. So I'd like to dive a little bit into your job currently, because one of the purposes of this podcast is to help people kind of feel out different careers and different roles and see what might speak to them. So starting with the impact that you're having, I'm wondering what kinds of challenges are you solving at work with Arcadis?
That's a great question. So my title is the Global Technical Director for Net Zero Strategy. So the big challenge I'm solving is net zero. Which is obviously very multifaceted, but a lot of the work that I do is focused on organizations who have measured their footprint and they have some kind of target. It might be net zero, might be a science-based target. And I am helping them, along with the whole team at Arcadis, helping them figure out what they should be doing to achieve those goals and developing decarbonization roadmaps. And what that really looks like is, one, starting with sort of ideation and brainstorming and getting as many people to the table as we can to say, how do you think this organization could decarbonize? And then taking all of those inputs back with the team and leveraging Arcadis's deep engineering expertise to say, how much do we think this is going to save in terms of carbon, in terms of dollars? How much will it cost? How long will it take? How complex is it to implement? And kind of all those different factors, and then creating that marginal abatement cost curve that shows us the anticipated carbon reduction for each dollar or euro you spend on the project. And then really helping our clients optimize. And we obviously do the optimization from a carbon and a budget perspective. But we can also optimize for various constraints, like how many people they have, any kind of regulations that are relevant. The United States, for example, has the new SEC ruling, which should be finalized here literally any day now. Maybe it will be final by the time this podcast comes out. And so we can kind of help clients optimize and really decide which projects make the most sense and in what order. And so we really give them this kind of multi-year roadmap of here's how many electric vehicles you should replace each year and how many charging stations you need to install each year to make sure you have enough capacity to charge all those vehicles. And here's, how many renewable energy projects you need to invest in which region. And here's the different procurement mechanisms that make the most sense for each of those renewable energy procurements that you need to make.
Wow. You guys really get down into the details.
We do. And I love it. It's very nerdy. And I think that's really fun.
Yeah. I like how it starts with the client, how it's not we come in and provide our expertise and tell you what to do. But the first thing you mentioned was getting ideas from multiple people within the organization and really trying to see what is important to them.
Yeah. And we absolutely bring our own ideas to the table. We can look at the different industries and say, hey, here's the things that generally make sense for, IT hardware manufacturing or retail. But we don't know the organization and the operations as well as the people who live it every single day. And I'm always amazed at the quality of ideas that come out of those sessions. There's tons of ideas that are not worth pursuing, and that's fine. When we're in brainstorming mode, it is quantity over quality. I don't care if it's a terrible idea. Let's get them all on the table because some of them are going to be such gems. And you're also going to learn things about how things need to be implemented because part of that conversation always kind of naturally brings up some of the pain points of we would really like to do X, but it didn't work last time, or we don't have the structure that we need, or we can't get the budget approval. And knowing what those challenges are in advance really helps us from a change management perspective to prioritize and say, hey, this could be really impactful from a carbon perspective. We know you've struggled with this in the past. Let's talk through how we can help you overcome those barriers because this is a project you absolutely need to do. Or maybe we find, hey, the carbon savings is not that great. There's lots of other projects that make more sense. And overcoming the inertia on this one is going to be so difficult that it's not worth it. And so we learn a lot in those ideation sessions.
That's great. It sounds really inspiring when you get to find an idea that has been suppressed for one reason or another and unlock that idea and unlock that individual and help them kind of bring their idea to the table.
Yeah. And honestly, a lot of times people just don't know what will reduce carbon. I've had so many engineers and people who are like running the floor in a manufacturing plant say, well, would doing such and such reduce our carbon emissions? Like, would keeping this piece of equipment longer instead of replacing it as often, like, will that reduce our carbon emissions? I'm thinking, heck, yes, it would. And it would reduce them actually by a lot because the embodied carbon of that piece of equipment is huge. And if you can get more life out of it, then you're going to reduce their emissions. And by working together, they can say, here's how much more life I can get out of this piece of equipment without losing quality of our process or, having a risk to safety or, those kinds of impacts. And I can say, and here's how much carbon you will save if you can extend the life of that piece of equipment by that many years. And so it's that partnership that we need. I don't know that there's the ability to extend the life of a piece of equipment on their manufacturing floor because I'm not a manufacturing expert. and they're not a carbon expert. And so it really takes both of us to get that done.
Absolutely. That's a great example. So when you're implementing these net zero projects, how do you communicate how these projects increase the resilience and have positive impacts in the company, the community, or the industry?
Oh, that's another great question. We actually just hired a global technical director for climate risk and reporting, and she and I are already collaborating super closely on this because net zero has some pretty clear ties to resilience and climate adaptation. And I would say net zero is a really important component of any low carbon transition plan. There's lots more to it than that, and looking at climate risk is super important. But the decarbonization aspect, I think, is a really significant component. And I think it can do a couple of things. The first is the obvious, is we need to emit less carbon. And net zero roadmaps show you how you're going to do that. But I think that some of the less obvious things can come from opportunities to drive innovation, to sell new products, to attract new customers, and really showing the business value of sustainability, which can build buy-in to expand the program from just net zero to including climate risk and resilience projects. I have worked with organizations who were looking to set some kind of environmental community goal. And it was so fun to work on because they had made that connection internally through all of their work on decarbonization of their own operations that, hey, this is more than just us. And we've got dollars we want to invest. Almost every company in the world spends money on their communities, as they should. And if we can help them spend that money in a way that is also good for the climate and good for the community, that's just a win-win in all aspects. And so I think encouraging companies to invest in their community as much as they're investing in their own business is a really great way to go about it. And we can help with the climate metrics that go along with that.
Definitely. Helping companies invest in the communities is a big win-win. All right. So in terms of what you do at work, could you describe just what your day-to-day work life is like what kinds of activities you're involved with and what kinds of tasks you're working on? All this task switching that's going on?
Yes. I am so glad that you asked this question because my next LinkedIn article is on this very topic. I am going to put my calendar on the internet, which is terrifying. But I'm going to do it because so many people ask this question. And I asked this question myself when I was in graduate school and exploring career options and doing informational interviews, which everybody should be doing if you're looking for a job. And I could not figure out what people did every day. And that was really frustrating to me. And people are still asking me that question. So I would say I spend about 50% of my time on direct client work. For me, at my point in my career, what that looks like is joining client calls and being kind of a subject matter expert on net zero. It also is a lot of advising teams on how to approach project work. So at the beginning of a project, I will sit down with the team and look at what we're supposed to be doing and when, and help them figure out a plan for exactly how to execute on that. I do a lot of connecting people to tools and resources within Arcadis. So, who's the expert on renewable energy in this region? Who's the expert on electric vehicles? Making those connections to make sure that our project teams have all the resources that they need. I also manage our tools for net zero. And so that's kind of like the client facing side. Oh, and I do quality assurance of deliverables, which is like not the most sexy thing to do, but it's really important because upwards of 70% of spreadsheets in the corporate world have mistakes in them. And we do our best to catch those mistakes before they go out the door. So I spend a lot of time looking at other people's spreadsheets, which is a skill in itself. And to be honest, like not my favorite thing. And that's okay.
Unnecessary evil.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's probably half my time. The remaining time is mostly split between strategy work. I am responsible for determining how Arcadis globally approaches net zero strategy with our clients. And so spoke briefly about the tool kind of maintenance and development piece. So I kind of maintain our internal tools on net zero and have teams working on them to improve them and build out functionality of those. I also maintain kind of a repository of past proposals that we can draw from if a client is looking for something similar that we've delivered before, and a huge repository of client experience. So projects we've executed successfully that we can include in proposals to say, here's where we've done this before. And then also really thinking big picture, long term of where is our sustainability advisory team headed in terms of serving net zero? What do our clients need and how do we deliver that? In terms of technology, in terms of skills, kind of looking at the horizon and saying, what skills do we have now and what skills do I think we're going to need in 2 or 3 years? And how can we start to hire and train internal people who are already here to make sure that we have the skills that we need to serve our clients today, but also several years from now. So a lot of that kind of forward thinking, looking at the market, what are our competitors doing? What do our clients need? And how can we do better? Which I love. And then it's strategy and I would say just one-on-ones. I spend a lot of time with people individually in the organization. Part of that is I have only been at Arcadis for about 5 months. And so I'm kind of still learning my way around. It's a 35,000 plus person organization. And I have a global role. So I touch over 8 time zones. And in any given week, work with dozens of different people. So spending time one-on-one, really digging into what do they need. My role is essentially an enabling function. I am there to make sure that our teams can deliver great work and develop actionable net zero roadmaps for our clients. And so I spend a lot of time asking, what do you need? And I love asking that question because it makes me feel helpful. And then I also, people ask me that too, which is really fun. Especially since I see myself as the enabler.
Yeah.
So yeah, talking about what's hard, what proposals do they have coming up? I might have a one-on-one with a prospective client and just say hey, what are your pain points? What are you trying to do that's not going well? And can we help you? So lots of that kind of learning curiosity piece. And then I would be remiss not to mention the administrative part of consulting, like timesheets and budget tracking and stuff that isn't that fun. And that's less than 10% of my time. But it is there.
You'd be remiss not to mention it, right?
Yeah. You got to do a timesheet. It's terrible. I hate it.
You've got a lot going on with all those different functions and both the client work and the internal strategy work. Some of the things that stuck out to me are the need for attention to detail with checking those reports and kind of picking out the key aspects of different people's perspectives that might need to be zoned in on. Networking and being that connector, being able to really draw different people together throughout such a large organization sounds really important. And being able to have that strategic perspective, be a forward-looking individual, and look towards the future.
And I think so. You're absolutely right. And those are all things you can do no matter where you are in your career. Those may sound like leadership things, which in my case they are, but I've been at this for more than 14 years. But I've been doing all those things since day one, and everybody should be thinking about those things. I think sometimes junior staff have this idea that they can't be a leader because they're not a leader. Their title doesn't have leadership in it. They're not experienced enough. I think all of that is BS. I think everybody can lead from where they are. Everyone can be forward-looking and be looking out for trends. And when you're earlier in your career, that might look a little more like reading articles and attending conferences and asking lots of questions. And also sharing things with your team. Hey, I read this article recently. It was really interesting. I do a lot of that, but I love it when junior consultants on our team do that because they see things differently than I do. And they can help me see trends that I don't notice because I've been at this for 14 years and they've been at it for 2. And I think also being a connector is something that everybody can do. Get to know people. It's very flattering for senior people to have a junior person say, hey, I'd love to have a coffee chat with you in person or virtual to learn a little bit about what you do and how you've been so successful. And then you can build your own network. And when a project comes up that needs one of those people, I don't care if you've been here for 5 minutes, you should raise your hand and say, oh, I know so-and-so, they might be able to provide some insights here. And those are all things that you can do at any stage of your career.
That's such an important perspective, especially for people who are looking to make sustainability a larger part of their current function, whether or not it's already. That's amazing. So we have just a minute or two left here, and I know you had a question you wanted to pose to those who are listening. Do you want to outline that real quick?
Yes, thank you. I have been plagued by this question recently. I do a lot of informational interviews. I'm part of Open Door Climate. It's a hashtag on LinkedIn. So feel free. I have sign-up slots available. I will do an informational interview with anyone. And I am getting so many questions about how do I transition from a non-climate career into a climate career. I have talked to lawyers and UX designers and HR and people in all different types of functions who have realized that they want to do something more with their career and that that could happen. They could do that with climate. I honestly have a really hard time advising those people because I've spent my whole career in climate. And obviously, like, I know what skills it takes and I know a lot about how sustainability works within an organization. And there are some things I can share and there are some pieces of advice that I do typically give. But I'm really interested to hear from people who have successfully changed careers or who are in the midst of it and have seen things work versus not work. I struggle, especially with how to present your resume. Oh my gosh, that's a hard question. Especially for people who have more than 5 years of experience. Like, you are a professional. You have valuable skills to bring to the table. But when I'm looking at 400 resumes for one role, if you don't have sustainability on it, like, unfortunately, I can't really consider you because so many people do.
Right.
And I usually need that expertise unless it's a very junior role. And the chances of me hiring someone with 5+ years of experience for a role that's meant for someone straight from undergrad is low because I can't pay you enough.
Right.
And it's a hard, from a hiring manager perspective, it's a very hard conversation to have. And so, yeah, I'm curious from you what you would tell career changers to do, and maybe what you've heard from other podcast guests.
Yeah, I mean, everything that we've talked about today is so vital to that question in terms of what kinds of skills to develop, what kinds of roles you should be looking out for. So I would welcome anyone to reach out to you and talk about it. And you said it was through Open Door Climate. That is the hashtag that people can reach out to you through?
Yes, there's a hashtag on LinkedIn for that. That will lead you to a website where you can actually sign up to see all the professionals who volunteer their time in that way. So if my career doesn't sound super interesting to you, there's lots of other folks who will be open to talking to you. And you can also find me on LinkedIn that way and just message me directly to request a spot.
Well, that sounds like one of the most valuable things that could be offered to somebody who's interested in learning more about what they can do with their career, and especially learning from someone who's been in climate for 14 years now. That's awesome. Well, thank you, Kealy. I appreciate you taking the time, and it's been an amazing conversation.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. This was great fun. Wonderful getting to know a bit about you. And I'm so pleased with this podcast and the work that you're trying to do. I think we need more people just like you.
Well, I'm sure that we could talk for another multiple hours and maybe future episodes about all of the great advice you have around sustainability careers. So thanks for sharing with everyone, and good luck with everything.
Thanks.
All right.